Hello everyone, my name is Denise and today I'll be talking on the topic dealing with anger, the spirit of bitterness and resentment. Okay, so let's just first talk about this definition of this word called trauma, or in this case, traumatized. Okay, it means to be subjected to lasting shock as a result of a disturbing experience or a physical injury. So for the span of this entire video, I'll be referencing this movie, the Silent Hill movie. So it's the movie that I'm referencing, not the computer game, although it is good to know that it is actually adapted from a computer game. So first, talk about the Silent Hill movie. It was a film that was aired in 2006. So when I was quite young, I watched it and it really stuck in my head. So when I thought about like what story should I use as a backbone to discuss this topic of anger, of trauma, then Silent Hill was the story that popped into my head. Although I must say that it's quite a horrible film. It's very scary. It's a psychological horror film. So be prepared to see a few scary pictures, maybe just one fairly scary picture in this video. I'm sorry it traumatizes anyone, all right? So if you're really scared, just close your eyes for that slide. I will give you a warning before I show it. Okay. So first, let's talk about the plot of this show. So this show began with a mother and a father. They adopted a girl called Sharon. So Sharon is this pretty little young girl, but she has a lot of weird things like sleepwalking and unexplained dreams, always asking her to go to this place called Silent Hill. So her mom decided to bring her to Silent Hill as to just like maybe close up tie up some knots, some loose ends or something. Just they were drawn to this place. So they went to this place, Silent Hill. Okay, so to cut the long story short, Silent Hill in reality is this place that was abandoned in the 1970s, which is like when this movie was played 30 years before, due to a massive coal steam fire. So it's been abandoned for the last 30 years, okay? So they met with an accident upon reaching the Silent Hill, and when they woke up, the girl Sharon was gone, but the mother, who is called Rose, is still around. So she's the main protagonist of the show. We'll be tracking her movement. So as she went along, okay, this show is a horror show, so it's going to be a bit bizarre. I'm going to the next slide. There's nothing scary in the next slide. Okay, so this Alisa is a splitting image of Sharon, her adopted daughter. Rose's adopted daughter looks just like this, but remember this happened 30 years ago, where this Silent Hill was still an inhabited place. Okay, so Alisa, this young girl, she was born out of wedlock. So this is a very conservative part of America. So they really bullied her in school, and she was eventually also, because they bullied her and she was very isolated, she was raped by the janitor. And then the very conservative church leaders decided to burn her alive, immolate her, to purify her from her sins of being raped. So she was a very what's that word, traumatized young girl, really traumatized until cannot traumatize already. All right. Okay. So at that point when she was being burned alive, the devil came in. Okay, this is not in the Wikipedia plot summary, because they didn't write it down, but this is from my memory watching it 15 years ago. That moment when she was being burned alive after she was raped, she was so traumatized, and the devil came in to make a pact with her. Okay, to say that right now, if you want to, you can get your revenge. I will make sure that every single one of those people who have bullied you and who have raped you and who have burned your life, they're going to get their just desserts. You just give yourself to me. So at that point, okay, according to the Wikipedia plot summary, her soul split into two parts. One is the one that remains in this twilight zone, so to speak, which is this alternate zone in Silent Hill. The other one was brought back into the real world. Her innocent side was brought back into the real world to become this newly embodied person called Sharon, who is eventually adopted by Rose. Okay, so remember, this is just one person, but she split into both sides. The Sharon, which is the innocent one, and the shadow side is the dark Alisa, the one that is 30 over years old in the hospital, still trying to get her revenge. Okay, next slide is going to be quite scary. There's going to be some people dressed in like a scary monster, so be prepared for that. Remember, they are just actors, okay? They're not real, so don't be scared. Okay, next up. Okay, so these are some of the nurses. Okay, beautiful part, interesting fact about this Silent Hill, it was not made using much CGI. So all these are real dancers. You can see how good their bodies are. They are dancers, but they're also very good at contorting their bodies in scary positions. So it was really a very creepy experience watching it. Anyway, these are the nurses guarding the dark Alisa. She was still lying on the bed. Now she's probably 38 or something. And the devil is still keeping her alive to feed on her anger, her vengefulness, her bitterness, to continue torturing the townsfolk. So these townsfolk, they're all trapped in this twilight zone. And the town itself will shift. Based there'll be a siren periodically, and the whole town will shift into this ghostly, ghastly state in which a lot of supernatural creatures will come out to attack you and to hurt you. So there's only one safe place, which is their church, that so-called the Dark Elisa could not get into. So unless you're like careless and you got lost, then you might actually get killed. But there's still a whole bunch of them still moving around, still very unrepentant after many years, and after being tortured by Dark Elisa's inner dark forces for 30 over years, okay? They're still hiding in that church. So anyway, it's quite dark, like the ending, which I will share a little bit with you just to close it so that you wouldn't have to watch the show yourself. Okay, so basically the mother eventually found this 30 over year old version of her daughter there and allowed her to possess her, which is the mother, Rose. So Rose could enter the church, right? Because church is a sanctuary, a so-called safe place. Rose could enter the church, so she brought the dark Alisa into the church and killed all those people there, thus so-called getting some form of a justice or vengeance. So after that, in this act, right, she managed to fuse the dark Alisa back to Sharon, with Sharon to form one full person, and they were so-called freed. And so they journeyed back to their own house, but they were still caught. They cannot see the husband, the father, Christopher. They cannot really interact with anyone else. They're still trapped in that twilight zone. It's like, it's not a proper closure. Okay, just to digress a little bit, this show, in my opinion, is definitely an archetypal movie, but there's a sense of a lack of closure, which I think is also deliberate because it's a horror show. It's a horror show, you don't want to have a happy closure with a good moral ending, you know what I mean? That may not be what you want to leave the viewers with. You probably want to leave them with a bad taste in their mouth because it's a horror show. Okay, fine, it makes sense. But there's a reason why, because when you close with a mass murder to exact vengeance, you typically don't have any good moral value except revenge is sweet. You see? Right? So if you just want to embody that feeling for a while, you realize that vengeance never ever leads to wholeness. Okay, moving forward, away from this scary slide. Nothing else is going to be scary in this video, okay? So don't have to be worried that this is going to terrify you or anything. I'm not going to do that. Everything else is going to be quite innocuous. Okay, talk about trauma work. So when people are freshly traumatized, like they just been through an accident or they just got raped, it may not be the time to really process it because they might be in shock. They dissociate. They may not even know that it has happened or it has happened, but they cannot really and admit it to themselves yet, not at that state. So like if I look at the first tombstone here, yes, they will require more grounding, more time and more tender loving care when it's fresh trauma. Okay, but when they are ready, which they will know, and it varies from person to person, then they can start to do trauma work, which is start to unpack it, start to talk about it. Okay, so when you have been traumatized, which I feel that all of us have been to some extent, and for me, I have my own share of being bullied when I'm growing up. So there are two, it's like trauma is this fairly neutral thing that's been given to you, and it's what you make of it. So if you manage to process it well, you get this thing, which is the second tombstone here, post-traumatic growth, which is a high level of compassion, connection with other people in their suffering, and also spiritual connectedness. And that's great. But us being humans, there are going to be unprocessed trauma because every day we get fresh trauma. You know, especially if you work on a high stress job like a nurse or a counselor, psychologist, you get freshly traumatized every day. And you cannot always be in the state of post-traumatic growth. There will be some unprocessed trauma, and that's the shadow side, so to speak. And that can rear its ugly head as anger and vengeance and bitterness if you are not careful. Okay, so this is the yin yang sign. When I put it here, you don't have to like feel that, oh no, this Taoism and all that. I'm just using it in a philosophical way to explain this point. No? Trauma, there are two sides, the light side, which is the white, and the dark side, the black. So the white side is the post-traumatic growth. People who have this post-traumatic growth are going to be more compassionate, more connected to other human beings than most people, but they also have a shadow side, which is they might get triggered more easily and they might deal with irrational anger from time to time. So they come as a pair. It's really hard to separate them. But there is a good end to this story. I mean, there's a good part, not an end to the story. There's a good part to note, which is that even in this unprocessed trauma, this dark side, there's some light in it, right? Because there is this unprocessed trauma, then you are able better to relate to your clients in a way, because you, from time to time, will realize that you are still fallen and you're not going to be proud, because that is very humbling. And even there's the pride of the post-traumatic growth, like, oh, see, I'm a survivor. I'm a survivor. I'm nothing like you. So that is probably the shadow side of the light side. Hope it's not confusing. Okay, next up. So there are different ways of calling it, like different ways of naming it, nomenclatures, different ways. So I love to use the word trauma because it's more compassionate. You can see that all of us have been traumatized. It's just to what extent. And it also gives a sense of that it's liable to change. And it's something like I told you, something neutral that you can either reap post-traumatic growth or become very bitter and resentful, or probably a combination of both. Okay, so something precious you can get as a result of this trauma. It's not something that you are inflicted with no promise of goodness that can come from it. Okay, but there is this thing, maybe some of you know DSM-5, they really want to pin it down as a definition, probably for the insurance company, so that they know what it's called, how you claim, what treatment, and then research also what treatment can be used to treat borderline personality disorder. But if you use BPD as the nomenclature, then it can be more derogatory for some, and also more rigid. That means not liable to change. There's no good side of borderline. But if you think about the yin yang sign, which I showed you just now, even if you are a borderline personality disorder, even if you've been traumatized, even if you have a lot of unprocessed trauma, there is still the light side to you. There's something special that you can offer that other people can't. So anyway, on the right are some definitions of borderline personality disorder: fear of abandonment, unstable, intense relationships, unstable self-image or sense of self, rapid mood change, impulsive behaviors, suicidal behaviors, persistent sense of emptiness, like an empty shell, anger management issues, and temporary paranoid thoughts. So you think about the dark Alisa, the girl who is 30 years on her hospital bed, frozen in that state of anger, of hatred, becoming a battery so that the devil can tap on her anger and resentment to torture the townsfolk. Okay, so she is possibly traumatized, or you could say she has borderline PD. And remember the town, right, is okay, this is a very beautiful symbol if you may not notice for Silent Hill. The town is usually quite peaceful, but remember the siren will ring and suddenly become this very ghastly place. This is really a very good symbol for borderline personality disorder. It's a very good, what's that word, metaphor. Because borderline personality disorder, if you have it or traits of it, you'll realize that sometimes it's going very well, and sometimes you're triggered, and wow, everything just comes out. You are triggered, and you also change the environment around you. So that is actually what's happening in Silent Hill. That's why I think that's why they call it a psychological horror film. I think they really nailed the BPD very well in symbolic form. Okay, next up. So we think about it, on the left, there's Alisa, and on the right, we have a picture of Jesus Christ. So I wouldn't say that Jesus suffered much less than Alisa, although some of you might want to argue with it. Okay, let's think about the tortures that Jesus went through. He was abandoned by his disciples at the Garden of Gethsemane. Then he was questioned in front of the council. They slapped him, spat on him. Then he was scourged at the pillar. Then there was the crowning of the thorns, carrying of the cross, and being finally impaled on his hands and nailed to the cross, dying in front of his mother, who was heartbroken, obviously. So all those psychological, physical pain that he had to go through. But yet, he did not, like Alisa, give way to the pact and make a pact with the devil to torture all of mankind. Instead, he came back and he was able to say, peace be with you. And that's why Christianity is so beautiful. It is, when there's trauma, you can swing to the left, which is, go for vengeance. But remember, like I mentioned just now, even when you do get the revenge, you may not find closure. Or you can swing to the right and be forgiving. Just as Christ is. Okay, next up. So this is one of the popular verses that people use when they're talking about forgiveness. Okay, it's from Matthew, the parable of the unforgiving debtor. And so the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who decided to settle his accounts with his servants. When the reckoning began, they brought him a man who owed 10,000 talents, but he had no means of paying. So his master gave orders that he should be sold together with his wife and children and all his possessions to meet the debt. At this, the servant threw himself down at his master's feet. Give me time, he said, and I will pay the whole sum. The servant's master felt so sorry for him that he let him go and cancelled the debt. Now, as the servant went out, he happened to meet a fellow servant who owed him 100 denarii. And he seized him by the throat and began to throttle him. Pay what you owe me, he said. His fellow servant fell on his feet and implored him, saying, give me time and I will pay you. But the other would not agree. On the contrary, he had him thrown into prison till he should pay the whole debt. His fellow servants were deeply distressed when they saw what had happened, and they went to the master and reported the whole affair to him. Then the master sent for him. You wicked servant, he said. I cancelled all that debt of yours when you appealed to me. Were you not bound then to have pity on your fellow servant, just as I had pity on you? In his anger, the master handed him over to the torturers till he should pay all his debt. And that is how my heavenly Father will deal with you, unless each of you forgive your brother from your heart. So this is the scary verse that we usually quote when we're trying to teach people, oh, you must forgive, don't be bitter or vengeful. Yeah, this is the verse, like, your sins are so much bigger. 10,000, let me go up and check how many. 10,000, let me see, talents versus 100 denarii. So since God forgive you for 10,000 talents, you should have to forgive your brothers and sisters who sinned against you. Small, 100 denarii. I mean, okay, so that makes sense if you live a fairly smooth life and your offenses are basically like, how dare you eat your dinner without waiting for me? Or how dare you not save a piece of cake for me? All these small little things might feel like 100 denarii, right? But what if you're like Alisa, you've been bullied your whole life, raped by the janitor, set on fire, then you won't feel that that is 100 denarii. That might feel like a whole 10,000 talents of debt. But if you think carefully about the Alisa story, you realize that yes, it's true that she was bullied for many years. Yes, she was raped. Yes, she was set on fire afterwards. But she laid in that hospital bed with all her anger and fury and vengefulness. She tortured the townsfolk for 30 years and eventually killed them all. So when you compare that 30 years of anger, of being frozen in that state of vengefulness and bitterness and resentment compared to what she received, it may not be like 100 denarii versus 10,000 talent, but it might actually really be comparable. That is what our anger can make us into. Exactly like our abusers, or even worse. So is that what you want to become? That's something to think about. Okay, next up. Okay, so what is good and permissible? I don't want any of you to feel that Denise or the all counselors are against anger, because anger is actually good and permissible. You think here, this is a picture of Jesus cleansing the temple of the money changers and those selling things. So being angry at the appropriate time, that is perfectly normal. In fact, a lot of counselors use this moral platitude. Say, Your feelings are like rainbow, like a rainbow. All the feelings are permissible. They're not be completely without anger. So anger is a permissible, good feeling to have. Okay. Yes, moral platitude, but it is, I'm trying to tell you that you can feel anger. And it's good to be aware of that anger boiling up inside of you. But anger is very different from, because it can become what's that word? Mutated and deformed into resentment and bitterness and vengefulness, and that is not good. Okay, I move to the next slide. So it's very unhealthy, yes, when anger goes into a spirit of bitterness and resentment. It starts by becoming vengeful fantasies, and from revengeful fantasies, it becomes actions. Like many of the school shooters, they were outcast, bullied boys that eventually decided to take a gun and then go into a school and shoot many young children. So that is the ugly side of anger if you don't manage it well. Okay, let me rephrase that, not manage it well. When you are not aware of it, and after you're aware of it, take active action to do the right thing. Like in Jesus' case, to cleanse the temple. Or if there's no right thing to do, then maybe process it. Find someone to process it and see whether what post-traumatic growth can you reap from this. Or even if it's not post-traumatic growth, what kind of learnings about yourself or the world can you make from this so that your future life would be better. Next up. Okay, so processing trauma, it's important to know that you're not alone, okay? Yes, there's a space for self-work. Like, especially someone like me who's been receiving counseling for years and being a therapist myself, it is possible for me to be more self-efficient, so-called proficient, and do some self-work. Can do journaling, I can walk, I can talk to my fellow counselors or my friends and my family. Those are self-work. But even then, I still go for bi-weekly counseling, and I also still have my supervisor to talk to. Okay? Okay, and then, I forgot to change the words there, but please forgive me, all right? Okay, the third tombstone, spiritual aid, is important to also connect to the church. You can talk to priests, pastor, leaders, counselors, but also don't forget to, like this man here, kneeling down and talks directly to God, to pray like, dear Lord, I'm really hurt by what has happened. I feel very ganged up against. I feel like I'm very bullied right now, but I really don't want to give in to the devil's temptation for bitterness and resentment. I want to love my enemies. Please help me. Please help me. Okay, so a genuine prayer like that, if you say it, it's going to be very powerful. So don't forget to pray. Okay. In conclusion, most of us are traumatized to a certain extent. I wanted to say all of us, but I suppose it is not impossible that there's a 0.0001% that just live a very sheltered life, okay? But even then, that is a form of trauma in itself. You understand it next time. Because over-coddling someone is also not good. Okay, so most of us are traumatized to a certain extent. You don't have to feel ashamed of it, okay? While expressing our anger is good, nursing a spirit of bitterness and resentment is not. So we have to, be healthy. We are aware of it. First, be mindful of our own anger, and then we can decide what to do with it. Do we want to give in all the time to vengeful fantasies, violent imagery, or we find some way to process it in not such a dark way, and get help from people who care, because there are people out there who care. Even if, let's say, you believe right now because you're down that there's no one who cares, that's not true. You can always, okay, if you believe that none of your friends and families care for you, then there are professionals out there who are trained to at least pretend that they care. How's that? So you come and we pretend that we care. How's that? At least you are getting some kind of help. Okay, with that said, it's not true that people just pretend that they help. There is definitely a part that genuinely care. Okay, and finally, you're not alone. And if you want to process it all by yourself and you're not trained and you're all isolated, then it's your hubris talking. It's better that you work. And even if you have one friend to talk it through, it's still better than to work on it by yourself. Don't be proud. Don't be hubristic. Get someone to walk with you in this journey in processing your trauma. Okay, let me stop share. So that's all for today's video. I hope it's been helpful to you. It was very difficult making this video because I had to look through all the pictures, the horrible pictures, to get some good stock photos. So researching this video was tough. Talking about my own, reviewing my own trauma, it's tough also. But I hope it's been helpful for you. So if you like this video, kindly press like, share, and subscribe. Thank you so much, and God bless.